Greetings, brothers and sisters. I just finished working out in the gym here, and I'm about to tuck into some breakfast here in my home. A little bit of bacon, some hash browns, eggs, sausage, some nice buttermilk pancakes over here. Right, some toast. Got some coffee brewing in the next room. And the reason I'm having this a little early today is because I'm going to be getting together with my friend, the Catholic Perennialist, later this evening. And I kind of want to get my dinner out of the way. You may recall him from previous segments of Points of Light Radio. He's here today to discuss and shed some light on some matters that God has laid on his heart. The topics for discussion in this particular segment will be, he sent this to me here, Christianity as a fraternal mystery school and Christ the Hermetic figure. I don't even know what that means, but I do know that this looks really good and the coffee smells great, so I'm going to enjoy my brunch here, and we'll get together with the Catholic Perennialist after I've eaten.
Ladies and gentlemen, seekers of light and secret knowledge wherever you may be, you are listening to Points of Light Radio, the podcast dedicated to taking you past the apron and behind the closed doors of lodges everywhere. And here is your host, Stan Miller.
I'm sure you can. Catholic Perennialist, welcome to Points of Light Radio.
Thank you.
Now, you are one of my YouTube subscribers, and you've been on here before, but it's been a while, so why don't you tell my listeners and viewers about yourself?
Well, I'm a retired school teacher. I used to teach Latin. I've been a member of the Catholic Church for about 10 years. Been a member of the Lodge for a few years. That's the Blue Lodge. I've done some translation work. I've translated the whole book of Matthew from Latin into English. I've read the Bible about 9 or 10 times, and I read a lot of esoteric material. I'm pretty familiar with Greco-Roman mythology and also early mystery schools.
So you're here to shed a little more light on the origins and evolution of fraternalism. So I believe the topics you wanted to discuss with us tonight were Christianity as a fraternal mystery school and Christ as the Hermetic figure. So why don't you just lead off with, I think you said you want to lead off with Christianity as a fraternal mystery school. So let's start there. Defining the brethren, you said.
Yeah, so what I would like to lead in with is the fact that although it's no longer treated as such or regarded as such, Christianity began as a mystery school. Mm-hmm. And it looks and feels, especially as it begins with Paul in the first century, it looks and feels a lot like Mithraism. And so it bears a lot of resemblance, I think, because it was the direct competition to Mithraism. And it had some distinct differences. Mainly it was co-ed. It accepted women as well as men, where Mithraism was really restricted to males, and in particular Roman males of the Roman military. But Christianity...
Do you believe that's why Paul was, shall we say, so persecuted in many ways? Like at one point they practically stoned him to death and everything, is because he was actually up. It wasn't just the Jewish leadership. He was getting a lot of people angry, wasn't he?
Well, in the first century, a lot of these mystery schools coming from the East, they were subversive, or they were considered subversive by the Roman authorities. And so they functioned as secret societies, and they had their own aims and their own goals. And for some of the Romans, they understood these as Persian infiltrators. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that's what Christianity was, but it could easily be misunderstood as such.
Okay.
But Pauline Christianity as being different than, you would say, Hebrew or Ebionite Christianity. Pauline Christianity bears the marks of of a mystical fraternity,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't take it seriously enough now. Christianity, for most people, most practitioners, is not taken seriously enough that we could regard it as a mystery school, but it in fact was. And the doctrines of the mystery schools and the doctrines of Christianity are not identical, but at the core, they have the same kernel. And I'll get into all that as we go forward. But I would say that for those looking for a fraternity to belong to, if there is no lodge in your town, or if it just doesn't appeal to you, more traditional forms of Christianity, in particular Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, some of the more liturgical Protestant churches, would actually function as a degree system. And I'm going to go ahead and get into the first point of defining the brethren, because when you have a fraternity, you have to define clearly who's in and who's out. And this was done more strictly in the first century, because today anybody can walk into a church and see the whole liturgy. They might not be able to take communion, but they can at least see the whole liturgy. But in the earliest days, the only people who could see a Eucharist service, a Eucharist is the communion service, the only people who could witness that and partake in it were people who had went through a long catechism first and then had been baptized. So baptism really served as the line of demarcation, and you might call this a first degree initiation, because it comes with an oath.
Okay. Now, initiatory rite of baptism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you wanted to expound on that a little bit, shall we say?
Yes, the initiatory rite of baptism is, I guess you could say, the equivalent of like a first degree initiation. It does come with a catechism. You might have to recite that in the form of an early creed, but it definitely comes with an oath that you have to swear. And anybody that's been initiated into a lodge understands that you have an obligation that you swear, that you have to recite a catechism, you have to give an oath. And so these things are very similar. And in Christianity, you're swearing faith in Christ, but you're also swearing to refuse and reject the world, the flesh, and the devil. And so, much like in lodge, one of the things I ask you is if you believe in a creator, if you believe in God. Well, this is more specific; it's more narrow. They ask you, do you believe in Christ? And you have to witness that you do. But then you also have to reject the world, the flesh, and the devil. And so, where in the lodge they'll ask, what makes you a master mason? And the answer is the obligation. If we in Christianity ask what makes you a Christian, you can say it's my baptism and the baptismal oaths that you swear. And so one's entrance into this mystery school of Christianity looks a lot like a lodge system from a certain point of view.
Now, you also have that you said the Pauline mysteries, the New Testament was a Mithraic contract. Now, I do know that Paul did talk enormously, like, behold, I show you a mystery, we shall not all sleep, and he a lot of mystery.
Yes.
And you're saying that was really sort of almost like a carryover, a language he was trying to use to reach certain people, or?
It was a common way of speaking in the ancient, you could say Middle East, the ancient Near East, where a lot of these mystery schools, mystery religions originated. There was always a mystery at the heart of the doctrine that you could not fully penetrate, you could not fully understand until you had received all of the initiatory rites. And so there are initiatory rites beyond baptism. For Paul, the next one would be the Eucharist, because you could only partake of the Eucharist, as he says, worthily. And this was only for those who had also received their catechism and then their baptism. Later on, within Catholicism, they add another one called confirmation. And so the typical Catholic parishioner, by the time he's a young adult, has been through these three initiatory experiences. And because there are 7 sacraments, he may go beyond that. But the bare minimum to be, you could say, a full-fledged Catholic would be these 3. And it starts to look a lot like a Blue Lodge system, where it has 3 initiatory rites before you're a full-fledged member. So for Paul, his mystery is this union with Christ that occurs in the Eucharist. But then he also has a third, you could say, his other major mystery doctrine would be the resurrection of the body. And so this is something that is chiseled into the creeds of the church. I believe in the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come at the end of the creed. But as Paul says, I think it's in 2 Thessalonians, he says, "Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all die, but we shall all be changed." Meaning that when Christ comes, the body of both the living and the dead will be renewed and will be given a body meant for eternity. And so the mystery at the heart of Paul's doctrine is the mystery of the resurrection, and it's the mystery of immortality, and you could say the immortality of the soul. And in this, Christianity is not radically different than any other mystery school, because at the heart of every other mystery school were two doctrines. One was the unity of God, and the second was the eternality of the soul, the immortality of the soul. And both were radical, but both are very radical doctrines for the time. Maybe not so much today because Christianity's popularized them. But initially, men believed that the gods were a multitude. They were polytheists, and they also believed that when you die, you might even just disappear into the soil. At the very least, you might become a shade in the nether regions, but you would never have a continued meaningful existence. That was something really that was a hope that was given by Christianity. That was not really a hope amongst the Greco-Romans or the Hebrews.
But didn't the Greeks believe in heaven and hell? Because I understand they talked about hell being a place called Gehenna.
The Platonists did. So Plato expounded a doctrine of, it was a combination of Elysium, the punishments of Hades, and for the perfect, you might even transcend life entirely and move on to the fields of the blessed. After some time being punished, you could be reincarnated in the Platonic system.
Yeah, because they never believed that hell was really this as brutal a place, shall we say, as Christians took it to believe. They believed it was a place where you did your penance. There were some bad parts of it, like levels of it, shall we say, depending on how bad you lived. Didn't they, or something like that?
The Greek hell was more like a purgatory. And
That's it, yeah.
The permanence of hell was restricted only to the very worst sinners in the Greek system. But for most of your common Greeks, not those who follow Plato's philosophy is actually more common and far-flung now than it was in the ancient world. And the ancient world is really a sect. But it was commonly held that souls would go down into Hades and they'd become a shade, which is just kind of a spiritual husk of who you used to be. And so when Aeneas goes down into Hades, he sees the shade of his father, who he could not save from the destruction of Troy. And he's not given any hope that his father will come out of that state. And so for the common Greek and the common Roman, not necessarily the philosophical, they didn't have a lot of hope after death of being anything more than a faded memory somewhere in Hades. The mystery that Paul expounds is a glorified eternity in which you receive back your body for the purposes of ruling and reigning with Christ.
Yeah.
So that was something new, but that was also coupled with the singularity of God, the unity of God, God the Father. So the creed starts out with, "I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord." And so there was this distinction between Father and Son, but the Trinity, over time, the Trinity would unify these three with the Spirit into a singular Godhead. And so in Christianity was expounded the essential mysteries of the mystery schools that they had kept secret for many, many millennia. Christianity made more plain, made more common, made more available. That is the unity of God and the hope of the immortality of the human person, coextensive with the body. So basically, the resurrection.
Okay, now moving along here, Christ as the Hermetic figure. Now you talked about We just discussed heaven and hell.
Hmm.
Now, Christ did say, he said, I have the keys to hell and of death. So you wanted to talk about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, so and I'll touch on Mithra too a little bit. Christianity functions kind of as the sum of all hope and myth, meaning all of the mystery schools of the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean kind of get funneled into Christianity. That is, Christ becomes endowed with all these facets and all these qualities that these other Hermetic figures held. And so when you look at the cult of Dionysius
Mm-hmm.
or that of Osiris, which preceded it, Osiris and Dionysius, they're both psychopomps. Osiris is there in Hades to guide you into the underworld.
Okay.
Dionysius likewise, and so you also have uh, Persephone. Persephone is one that makes a journey into hell once every year. And now Christ only went into hell once, as it says in the Creed. He was
Mm-hmm.
crucified. He descended into hell. He
Now
only
to
descended into
appear in the
hell
presence
once.
of God and all that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So he was resurrected up into the presence of God. He only does this once. However, it's celebrated annually. And it's
Hmm.
celebrated around the same time that Persephone would be released from Hades as well. And so
Easter.
Christ has the keys to hell and death that makes him Osirian, very much like Osiris.
Oh.
We're offered his blood in terms of wine, and so in that way he's like the god of wine, Dionysius, and he spends 3 days and 3 nights in hell, just as Persephone spends 3 months in Hades. So
Oh.
the number three is very significant here because these are the 3 months that the sun is defeated by night. So from the time that the time of the night exceeds the day at the solstice until the vernal equinox is 3 months, and so those 3 months are considered three. You could say three individuals that strike down the sun, just as in the Hiramic legend, there are three ruffians that strike down Hiram. And with Christ, there are three individuals as well, not just the 3 days that he's subsumed under the earth, but he's struck down by the scheming of Judas, Caiaphas, and then Pontius Pilate, which
Oh.
which represent the mob. So that's the common man, the rabble, is Judas with his base monetary motivations. And then you have the church, which is symbolized by Caiaphas, and then you have the state symbolized by Pontius Pilate. These all three conspire to kill Christ. And so that is, you could say, the three ruffians within the Christian narrative. And that is represented also by the 3 months that defeat the sun between the solstice and the vernal equinox, and also the 3 days that he spends in the tomb. All these threes come up symbolizing much the same thing, but I think it originates with Persephone. And Persephone is that, you could say, Hermetic figure which communicates between heaven and hell, and by virtue of her resurrection out of Hades, brings resurrection to the foliage of the earth.
And where Freemasonry gets its threes, one of the big places where Freemasonry gets its 3 degrees in doing things in threes, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a completeness in three, and that goes back to um, Pythagoras, because if you, and I'll try to make this quick, but basically, base reality as it extends from unity jumps over two and simply becomes three. And for this reason, if you graph a point on a sheet of paper, that's notional. That a point has no existence, and neither does a line. You don't get any three-dimensional existence until you make a third point and triangulate.
But
And
it
so,
also goes against human nature because we believe in even. We believe in being even, Steven. Three
mhm.
is a crowd, stuff like that. Whereas these mystery schools are teaching us, no, it doesn't hurt to be odd or whatever, right?
um, there's a significance that Pythagoras attached to every number, and he even attaches a
Oh.
significance to two. But the the idea of the Platonic solid or the Pythagorean solid means that material reality, creation, everything that emanates from the unity of God begins at three. And so this is why we have not a binity, but a trinity in Christianity. Yet God is one in essence. And so we like to think that originated with Christianity. In actuality, it probably originated with Pythagoras and Plato. I mean, even in the Indian religion of Hinduism, you have three essential deities that make up a type of trinity, it's Brahma, Shiva, and the third one escapes me. But you understand what I'm saying, that even in a polytheistic religion, they do have a trinity amongst them. And you can find this trinity even in the Egyptian faith with Osiris, Isis, and Horus. And so typically it's going to be represented as a father, a mother, and a son, typically. And this is another way in which Christ is a Hermetic figure. He exists between two poles. So the spirit initially in Christianity was considered feminine, the father obviously masculine. And it is the father who sends the spirit to impregnate Mary. And between these two, the spirit and the father, the son exists as the Hermetic figure. And so he exists not just between God and man, but between extreme opposites as he's hanging on the cross, because to his left and right are criminals. One is shown mercy and one is shown severity. And so Christ, as he's on the cross, he's hanging between heaven and earth, communicating between the two, and also between these extreme poles of mercy and severity, which is extremely Kabbalistic.
Yeah. Okay, so now you talked about here, he rises in the spring when the sun gains victory over darkness as Apollo in Sol Invictus. So, explain.
Yeah, so basically, Apollo as a personification of the sun god, and Sol Invictus simply being the sun, the unconquerable sun. The sun was thought to die daily in a sense, but resurrect every day. But in a broader, more annual scale, the sun is struck, you could say, at the autumnal equinox. He's struck by those 3 months, which cause a waning of his strength, and then he dies around December. And then he remains dead for those 3 months, and then resurrects and overcomes the dark at the vernal equinox. And so because every year the sun conquers the night, he was called Sol, that is sun, Invictus, which means the unconquerable. So the unconquerable sun is essentially a reference to this solar cycle. But what we find in Christianity is that Christ actually, in the story and in the Christian calendar, follows exactly that pattern. That he is struck down by the three ruffians that we were talking about, and he spends 3 days under the soil. So there's 3 months in which the sun is stricken from his strength, starting at autumn. Those 3 months are, you could say, Judas, Caiaphas, and Pontius Pilate, and then dies, and then lays for a further 3 months underneath the soil until in the autumn. In the spring, roughly around the time that we celebrate Easter, he resurrects. He comes out of the tomb. That is, finally, the day is longer than the night. This was extremely important for ancient people because they didn't have a mechanistic understanding of the universe. They believed that part of this was up to chance, or part of this was up to the variable, changeable nature of the gods. And the fact that the sun was so gracious to them as to provide them a growing season every year was something to be thankful for. And so the Christ story follows this pattern of Sol Invictus, and this is not by accident. So in this way, when you partake in the Easter celebration, it's not a strictly Christian event. It's something that could be recognized by any follower of any of these Hermetic figures going back into antiquity.
Exactly. So, yeah, and I've often said that as well, that people always say, but you can't, when they look at some of the symbols within Freemasonry and other fraternal orders, they say, yeah, but you can't, you know, that means, that's kind of that is a shall we say, that is a pagan symbol. You can't really, you can't just say, well, for instance, that all-seeing eye is the all-seeing eye of Jesus. You can't do that or whatever. Whereas, and I've said this before, by their inception, Christmas and Easter were pagan holidays in many ways. They really
correct, yeah.
And I think like we a lot of people in the faith community, shall we say, forget that.
Yeah, the sun is at its weakest just before December 25th, and so the sun's birthday is right after the winter solstice, because that's when he has not yet conquered the dark, but the sun begins to come back from its darkest position in the sky. It was also coincident with Saturnalia. So Saturnalia and the solar cycle combined to give us the Christian celebration of Christmas. And I don't see any problem with identifying these things. I think that it just shows that Christianity didn't arise out of a vacuum. And also, Easter, just the name in English itself, is derived from the word east.
Yeah.
So what happens in the east? Well, obviously, the sun rises in the east, which is just another reference to the resurrection.
Precisely.
So, yeah, these things are far more ancient than the church, and I think it's valuable to understand that, because the things that are valuable within the church are things that are universally valued amongst humanity. And so it takes it from a sectarian, it universalizes something that could be sectarian. And I think that's a positive.
So, is there anything else you'd like to share with us, sir?
Yeah, so to get back to Mithras, Mithra was a god of contract. He guarded and assured the fulfillment of contracts. And so when we say testament, as in New Testament, it comes from the word testes, and this is going to sound really strange, but in the ancient world, when you swore an oath on a man's testicles. And that's very, very odd. And people, but if you look at the Old Testament, when Abraham swore an oath with his servant, he caused the servant to place his hand underneath of Abraham's thigh. I always thought that was a weird thing to do, but the Bible is using a paraphrastic to say that the servant is actually swearing on Abraham's testicles. And the reason for this is that this is a man's most valuable possession, because this is where his heirs come from. And so a testimony or a testament is an oath, essentially. It's an oath that's being sworn. And so when Paul talks about the New Testament written in his blood, he's talking about a contract that Jesus has made with those who adhere to him, those who believe in him. And the contract is this, that if they believe in him and they bear their own cross for his sake, that he will come back and get them as the Hermetic psychopomp, that he'll come back and get them and raise up their body and take them to heaven.
Well, it makes sense because, it makes sense what you're saying, because the Greeks never believed in covering up nudity. You see those Greek statues, the guy's got it all hanging out type thing. Even when they show women, breasts are never covered. So these things were important.
So there wasn't the shame attached to it that we have today. So as you know, the Greeks would wrestle in the nude. They would do their foot races in the nude. And so testicles, this sounds really crude, but they were often more exposed than we would have them today. And so it would just be under the man's tunic. And they would swear an oath on the most valuable thing a man possessed. And because this is where all of his heirs came from, that was what was sworn on. And John the Baptist talks about the rocks of Abraham. And he says to the Pharisees, he says, think not within yourselves the way of Abraham as our father. He says, God is able from these very stones to raise up children unto Abraham. He was pointing to rocks on the ground, but it was a euphemism. Because in the Hebrew language, stones or rocks can also mean testicles. So he says, don't think that you're some high and mighty people because you come from the stones of Abraham. God could raise up children from those literal rocks on the ground over there.
Okay.
And so that builds into that word. From testes, we get that word testimony. And when we read New Testament, this is a new covenant, a new agreement. And Christ, as a type of Mithra, is the guarantor of that agreement through his blood. And so when you have faith in Christ, you're really having faith in him as a guarantor of a covenant, a guarantor of an oath that he himself has made. In addition to that, I wanted to say that as Christianity went from esoteric to exoteric, that is, it went from a mystery school that was often in hiding, often in the catacombs, it became fashionable. And it did so through one convert, Constantine. And Constantine was a worshiper, as his father was, of Sol Invictus. But if you understand that the Christian calendar and the life cycle of Christ follows very much the cycle of the sun, the solar cycle, it is not a stretch to say that Constantine didn't have to change much of what he thought or believed to switch from the worship of Sol Invictus to the worship of Christ. And when he sees this vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, before he becomes the sole ruler of Rome, he sees a vision in the sky, and he hears the words, in hoc signum vincus, which means in this sign you conquer, or you will conquer. He sees the vision of a cross in the sun. And so the solar cross is actually a much older symbol than the Christian cross. It is an equidistant cross. The arms are identical. But if you know anything about alchemy or alchemical symbolism, the symbol of the sun, the solar symbol, is a circle with a equidistant cross in the center. So this is what Constantine sees. He sees a cross in the sun, and here's the words, in the sign of the cross you will conquer. And then after that, he starts building churches inexplicably. And by the time he is on his deathbed, he receives his baptism, which was more common back then to reserve even your first initiatory rite to your deathbed. There were theological reasons for that. But he became a sincere believer in Christ after the Battle of Milvian Bridge, switching from the worship of the sun to the worship of Jesus. And it's after this that with state sponsorship, Christianity goes from a mystery school to an exoteric state religion.
Wow. Well, you said some very deep things tonight, sir, and I appreciate your time. And we look forward to having you back and giving us, I believe you have a part 2 to this explanation. So
yes, there is part 2.
Thank you for your time tonight.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. The Catholic Perennialist, brothers and sisters, back once again, fellowshipping here with us and expanding our knowledge of fraternal history, shall we say. Let me just give you some thoughts of my own, because this was a very deep segment here again, as the segments always are. But this was a very deep segment, so I'm going to give you my thoughts, and then I'm just going to leave you to, digress in your own way and maybe leave your thoughts in the comments section. But my sentiments from what I've seen here is that much of what he said here, you've heard here before, only he expands quite a bit on what you saw here on Points of Light Radio and heard here. First of all, as I've often said, that passage of secret knowledge, the secret society, or the society with the secrets, shall we say, is much older than we thought. Many of the fraternal orders that you saw on here had their origin, shall we say, around the 1600s. As far as I know, most of them aren't much older than that. Many of them are quite a bit younger than that. This is 2025. So think about it. Historically speaking, fraternalism is not that old, like as we know it. But we're not just talking about fraternalism. We're talking about the passage of secret knowledge and those societies with their secrets, right? Which go back and in many ways predate even biblical times, right? At least that you read about, okay? But also, you've heard me say this before, I believe it was on the October 23, 2023 segment of Points of Light Radio, where during that segment I covered some of how, especially the New Testament Christians that you read about in the book of Acts, how they were oftentimes holding their meetings in secrets. They had their own symbolism, probably their own little, shall we say, passwords and so on, right? You saw that here. Only our guest tonight really expanded on that, right? He also talked about where many of the, shall we say, what we today observe as Christian holidays actually had their beginnings in more pagan holidays, shall we say, that came from, like we talk about, that lined up, shall we say, with the solstices and so on, right? So, I mean, I have heard it said that Jesus was not born in December. The fact that even the simple fact that you had shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flocks by night, they weren't out there in the month of December. It'd probably be too cold. They were probably out there probably sometime in the fall or somewhere in the spring. So Jesus probably wasn't born, but that holiday was brought together to, the observance of his birth was probably brought together at around, the December period to coincide with other festivals that were going on at that time. So, I mean, you've heard me say that before, but that's really all I have to say on this. As I said earlier, I'm going to let you sort of discern, what you want from this segment. And I do encourage you to leave your comments and your input behind. Whatever it is that you discern from this, I want you to leave it in the comments, because I really want to hear from you what you think. All right, so I'm going to leave it there. This is always a good time. I hope you enjoyed this. But before I go, I want to remind you that this podcast is available on both YouTube and Spreaker. Please share, like, and subscribe when viewing Points of Light Radio on YouTube. I also welcome your comments and input. I also want to draw your attention to the PayPal link, that you can hit on that link and make a voluntary donation to this podcast, and I will use that to move Points of Light Radio forward. You can follow Points of Light Radio on my Facebook page at facebook.com/Points of Light Radio. You can see the link to my Twitter handle, my Spotify channel, as well as my Bluesky handle there in the details section of this segment. You can also see the link to my Points of Light Radio store. Brothers and sisters, this has been such a pleasure fellowshipping with you and my guest today. And until we meet again, just step into the light.